Celeste Kennedy's hands went cold the moment her eyes landed on the contract. The crystal water glasses on her tray caught the amber light of the wall sconces, sending fractured gold across the polished mahogany table. She should set them down, bow her head, and disappear back through the kitchen doors where she belonged. In 3 months of serving in Kangdae's private dining room, she'd mastered the art of being furniture, present but unseen, functional but forgettable. But that clause, Section 4, Subsection B, her breath shortened. The words blurred and sharpened in her vision like a knife coming into focus. Eminent domain facilitation. She'd know that language anywhere. It was carved into her memory the way trauma carves itself into bone. Those same words had destroyed her father, stripped him of his property, his business, his will to live. No, this couldn't be happening again. Kangdae's hand reached for the pen. His fingers, elegant and controlled, moved toward the signature line. The man beside him, an associate whose name she didn't know, smiled as if the deal was already done. Celeste's pulse hammered in her throat. Stay silent. Serve the water. Walk away. But her father's face flashed behind her eyes. The hollow look in his gaze during those final months. The way he'd whispered, "They hid it in the fine print, baby." By the time I understood, everything was gone. The pen touched paper. "Excuse me, sir." Her voice cut through the low murmur of conversation. "But this clause is a trap." The room went still. Kangdae's hand stopped mid-stroke. His head turned slowly, dark eyes finding her across the table. The casual authority in his expression shifted, hardened, into something cold and deadly. 6 feet of controlled power in a charcoal suit, the kind of man who'd built an empire on knowing when someone was lying. His voice, when it came, was quieter than she'd ever heard it. Quieter and infinitely more dangerous. "What did you just say?" What secret was the waitress hiding behind her crisp uniform and careful silence? Why did she recognize legal language sophisticated enough to fool Kangdae's own attorneys? And what would the most dangerous man in Chicago do now that she'd spoken words that could unravel everything? The answers would shatter the carefully constructed walls between her past and present. The truth would expose a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of city government. But first, Celeste Kennedy had to survive the next 60 seconds. Welcome back, my fierce hearts and midnight dreamers. Before we dive in, make sure you're subscribed, hit that like button, and tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing our little dark romance family stretch across cities, countries, and time zones. Every click, every comment, every bit of love you leave here helps us keep unraveling these dangerous love stories and high-stakes betrayals together. So find your quiet place, dim the lights, and get ready. Because tonight, I'm taking you into a world where contracts kill, councilmen are kingmakers, and a fallen lawyer and a mafia boss will burn a city to the ground for justice and love. 3 months earlier, Celeste had stood at the entrance of Kangdae's club with $47 in her wallet and a lie folded in her pocket. The building rose before her, dark glass and brushed steel, the kind of place where power concentrated itself into a single address, where fortunes shifted over dinner, where the men inside shaped the city from behind closed doors, while the rest of Chicago pretended not to know. She clutched her forged resume, each line carefully constructed to show only the acceptable version of her life. Waitress at the Palmer House. Night shifts at a diner in Bronzeville. Hostess for a corporate catering company. Everything else, everything that mattered, had been surgically removed. The manager, a sharp-eyed Korean woman named Hana Park, studied her with the expression of someone who'd evaluated hundreds of desperate women and knew exactly what to look for. "You understand discretion?" "Yes, ma'am. What you see here stays here. What you hear here stays here. No questions. No curiosity. No conversations outside these walls." Hana's gaze didn't waver. "Mr. Kangdae values invisibility in his staff. Your background, your air, you exist only when needed. Can you do that?" Celeste met her eyes with the quiet dignity of someone who'd already died once and was just moving through the aftermath. "I need this job. I won't cause any problems." And she hadn't. For 3 months, Celeste Kennedy had been the perfect ghost. She arrived at 5:30 each morning, prepared the private rooms, served lunch meetings where territorial disputes were discussed in careful euphemisms. She cleaned up after dinners where deals were sealed with handshakes that meant more than signatures. She ate her staff meal in silence in the back kitchen. She changed in the narrow staff room. She left through the service entrance at 4 o'clock, never lingering, never looking back. She never paused when Kangdae held court in the main lounge, his presence commanding gravity itself, men twice his age deferring to him with barely concealed fear. She never reacted when conversations drifted through open doors. Discussions about property acquisitions that skirted legality, about city officials who owed favors, about competitors who'd made fatal errors in judgment. She'd built a wall between who she was and who she'd been. Between Celeste Kennedy, Waitress, and Celeste Kennedy, former real estate litigation specialist at Morrison and Webb Associates, one of Chicago's most aggressive firms, where she'd been brilliant before she'd been destroyed. The wall had felt solid, permanent, necessary for survival, but walls only hold until something strikes them hard enough. And Section 4, subsection B, struck like a wrecking ball, because those words, that specific, carefully crafted legal language, were identical to the trap that had killed her father. Not metaphorically killed, actually killed. Slowly, legally, with documents instead of bullets. The clause that had stripped him of his commercial property, his life's work, his reason to keep breathing. She couldn't watch it happen again. Not even to save herself. Not even standing in front of Kangdae, who could erase her from existence with a single phone call. The moment she spoke, his associate went quiet. The ambient conversation died. Kangdae set down the pen with deliberate care and rose from his chair. He crossed the room in 3 measured steps. Unhurried, controlled, predatory. He stopped close enough that she could smell cedar and smoke, close enough that the heat radiating from his body made her skin prickle with awareness. You recognize something. Not a question. His voice had dropped to a lethal whisper that made her pulse spike. In my contract, explain. Now. Every survival instinct screamed at her to lie. To backtrack. To drop the tray and run for the exit and never look back. But another part of her. The part that had spent 2 years in hiding. The part that still woke up dreaming about her father's funeral. The part that was so tired of being invisible. Refused to break. Section 4, subsection B, she said, forcing her voice steady even as her hands trembled on the tray. The eminent domain facilitation clause. It looks like standard protective language for municipal compliance. But it's not. She made herself meet his eyes, those black, unreadable eyes that had ordered terrible things without flinching. The trigger language is asymmetric. Maybe subject to versus shall be considered. The phrasing means the city can invoke eminent domain proceedings against your property after you purchase it, but you can't challenge the valuation methodology. They'll offer fair market value, but the appraisal method is specified in subsection C, and it's designed to fail. 40% reduction for community benefit offset. You buy this land for $20 million, invest another 10 in development, and they seize it for $12 million. You lose everything. They profit from every improvement you make. The silence that followed felt like drowning. Kangdae stared at her. Not through her, not past her, but directly at her, as if truly seeing her for the first time. His jaw tightened. Something shifted behind his eyes, dangerous and curious and impossibly focused. Who are you? Each word fell like a stone into still water. Celeste's hands shook. The truth clawed at her throat, demanding release. Someone who's seen this exact clause before, she whispered. Someone whose father was destroyed by it. Someone who watched him die knowing he'd been cheated by legal language he trusted. She swallowed hard against the grief rising in her chest. My name is Celeste Kennedy. I was a real estate litigation specialist, and the man who designed this trap, Councilman Richard Stone, is the same man who killed my father. Kangdae's expression didn't change, but the air between them shifted, thickened with possibility and danger. He gestured to one of his associates with a subtle movement of his hand. The man immediately rose and left the room, closing the door behind him with a soft click. Sit, Kangdae commanded. Celeste didn't move. I should go. I shouldn't have said anything. Sit, not a request. Her legs obeyed before her mind could protest. She set down the tray and lowered herself into one of the leather chairs. The same chairs where she'd watched powerful men negotiate their futures, where fortunes had been won and lost over cigars and whiskey. Now she sat there in her crisp server's uniform, her hair pulled back in a practical bun, facing a man who could destroy the fragile life she'd rebuilt with a single word. Kangdai moved around the table and pulled up a chair beside her. Not across from her in the position of authority, but close enough that she could see the sharp intelligence in his eyes. Close enough that she couldn't escape. "Read it," he said, pushing the contract toward her. "All of it. Tell me every trap you see." "Mr. Kangdai, Kangdai," he interrupted, his gaze never leaving her face. "And you're going to tell me your real name, your real story, and exactly why you know this language. But first, you're going to dissect every clause in this contract. Because if you're right about Section 4, and I believe you are, then there's a reason you recognized it, and I'm going to know what that reason is." Celeste's hands trembled as she pulled the document closer. But as her eyes scanned the first page, something shifted inside her. Her mind sharpened. The familiar rhythm of legal analysis kicked in. The skill that had once been her greatest asset before it became her curse. This was muscle memory. This was who she'd been before survival forced her to forget. "Section 2, the payment schedule," she began, her voice steadying as the professional persona she'd buried fought its way to the surface. "The language specifying installment basis conditional upon municipal approval creates a termination trigger. If approval is delayed beyond 90 days, which Section 4 guarantees it will be, the seller can void the contract and keep your deposit. You lose $2 million before you ever own the land." She looked up and found Kangdai watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Keep going," he said softly. And for the first time in 2 years, Celeste Kennedy stopped hiding who she was. The associates filed out like shadows dissolving at dawn, leaving only the weight of revelation hanging in the air. Celeste remained frozen in the leather chair, her server's uniform suddenly feeling like a costume she'd outgrown mid-performance. Kangdai moved with the precision of a predator reassessing its prey. He pulled his chair closer, close enough that the heat radiating from his body made her skin prickle with awareness. Close enough that she could count the exact moment his cologne, cedar and something darker, more dangerous, invaded her senses and made thinking difficult. "Start from the beginning," he commanded, his voice dropping to that lethal whisper that seemed to bypass her ears and sink directly into her chest. "Every word, every clause, every trap you see." Her hands trembled as she pulled the contract closer, but the moment her eyes focused on the legal language, something shifted. The scared waitress receded. The litigator she'd buried clawed her way back to the surface, sharp and hungry. "Section 2, she began, her voice steadying with each word. "The payment schedule. Installment basis conditional upon municipal approval creates a termination trigger disguised as standard procedure. If approval delays beyond 90 days, which Section 4's eminent domain clause guarantees it will, the seller voids the contract and keeps your deposit. $2 million gone before you ever own the land." She felt his gaze on her face like a physical touch, intense and unblinking. "Section 7, the development timeline. Substantial completion within 18 months or forfeit improvement costs. But Section 4's language ensures permit delays that make that timeline impossible. You build, you improve, you lose everything you've invested when they seize it for pennies on the dollar. How do you know this pattern?" His question cut through her analysis like a blade through silk. Celeste's throat tightened. The memory rose like bile. Her father's hollow eyes, the hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and death, the way he'd whispered her name one final time before the monitors went flat. "Because I watched my father die from it." The words scraped out raw and bleeding. He was a small business owner, proud. He'd built his commercial property from nothing, a warehouse he converted into artist studios in Pilsen. 20 years of his life poured into those walls. She forced herself to meet Kangdai's eyes, even as her vision blurred with unshed tears. Councilman Richard Stone approached him with a development opportunity, a partnership that would revitalize the neighborhood and triple his property value. The contract was 200 pages of legal language my father trusted, because the city's name was on it. Because Stone showed up with architects and planners and a vision that made my father believe he was finally going to secure our future. Her voice cracked. Kangdai didn't move, didn't speak, just watched her with that impossible focus. He signed. 3 months later, the city invoked eminent domain through that exact clause. Section 4, subsection B. They offered him 40% of fair market value, citing community benefit offset. He tried to fight it, hired a lawyer with money he didn't have, but the language was airtight, legal, designed to look protective while being poison. She dragged in a shaking breath. He lost everything. The property, his savings, his reputation. His heart gave out 6 months later in a county hospital because we couldn't afford the private care he needed. The doctors said it was a massive coronary. I knew better. They'd killed him with documents instead of bullets. The silence that followed felt like drowning in deep water. Then Kangdae reached across the table and did something that shattered every assumption she'd built about him. He placed his hand over hers. Not grabbing, not restraining, just covering her trembling fingers with his warm palm. The touch was shockingly gentle from a man who'd ordered terrible things without flinching. Who designed the trap? His voice had lost its edge, replaced by something cold and focused. Not sympathy, something far more dangerous. Shared fury. Stone's son, Adam. He runs a boutique legal firm that specializes in municipal development contracts. They're the architects. Stone provides the political cover. Together they've displaced dozens of small property owners across Chicago over the past 5 years. Kangdae's jaw tightened, a muscle flexing beneath his skin. He released her hand and pulled his phone from his jacket pocket, typing rapidly with controlled aggression. "Do-yun," he said when the call connected, his voice returning to that commander's tone. "I need everything on Councilman Richard Stone and his son Adam. Property transfers, contract drafts, municipal filings, everything. And find out who's backing their land acquisitions." He ended the call and turned back to Celeste, his dark eyes burning with something that made her breath catch. "I need to know who you really are," he said quietly. "Your real name, your real credentials, everything you've been hiding." Celeste's pulse hammered. This was the cliff edge. The moment she either fell or flew. "Celeste Kennedy," she whispered, "former real estate litigation specialist at Morrison and Webb Associates. I graduated top of my class at Northwestern Law. I specialized in complex property disputes and municipal code violations. I was good, very good. Until my father's case destroyed everything. The firm partnered with Stone's developers on several projects. When I tried to use internal resources to investigate my father's case, they terminated me for conflict of interest and threatened to report me to the bar for misuse of client resources." She laughed bitterly. "They blacklisted me. No firm in Chicago would touch me. I couldn't practice law, couldn't get a reference. My resume became toxic. So I erased Celeste Kennedy the lawyer and became Celeste Kennedy the waitress. Someone invisible, someone safe." Kangdae stood abruptly, the motion controlled but charged with barely restrained energy. He paced to the window overlooking the city, his city, and stood with his hands clasped behind his back. "You saved me tonight," he said without turning around. "Not just from a bad deal. From destruction. That contract would have buried me the same way it buried your father. Do you understand what that means?" Celeste shook her head, even though he couldn't see her. He turned then, and the look on his face stole the air from her lungs. It wasn't gratitude. It was something far more dangerous. Recognition. The acknowledgement of an equal. "It means I owe you everything," he said softly. "And it means you're going to help me destroy the men who killed your father." Before she could respond, the door opened and a tall, lean man with sharp features entered, carrying a tablet. His eyes swept over Celeste with cool assessment before settling on Kangdae. "Boss, verified." Do-yun's voice was clipped, efficient. "The firm that drafted your contract is Stone and Associates LLC. Owned and operated by Adam Stone. Municipal contracts are their specialty. And there's more. The silent partner funding their acquisitions is Tae-suk." The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Tae-suk, even Celeste knew that name, Kangdae's rival, the man who'd been trying to muscle into his territory for years. Kangdae's face transformed into something terrifying and beautiful. Cold fury barely contained beneath perfect control. When he looked at Celeste again, his eyes burned with dark promise. "They made this personal," he said quietly. "Now we make them pay." The rain started as Kangdae's car wound through Chicago's late-night streets, drops streaking the tinted windows like tears the city was too hard to shed. Celeste sat in the back seat, acutely aware of Kangdae's presence beside her, close enough that every breath drew in his scent, close enough that the heat between them felt like its own living thing. Du-yun drove in focused silence while another guard occupied the passenger seat. The weight of what she'd confessed, what she'd agreed to, settled over Celeste like a second skin. "Where are we going?" Her voice sounded foreign even to herself. Steadier than expected, touched with something that might have been anticipation rather than fear. "Somewhere safe," Kangdae replied. "Somewhere Stone's people won't find you. You broke your cover tonight. They'll know by morning that the invisible waitress is actually the daughter of David Kennedy. They'll come for you." The casual certainty in his tone made her chest tighten. The car pulled into an underground garage beneath a building that screamed wealth and power, dark glass and steel reaching toward the storm-heavy sky. They rode a private elevator in loaded silence, and when the doors opened, Celeste stepped into a penthouse that redefined luxury. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city, rain painting them in shifting patterns that caught the low amber lighting. Dark leather furniture anchored the space, but it was the walls that captured her attention, covered in original artwork, each piece carefully chosen, each frame telling a story of taste and control. "Sit," Kangdae said, gesturing to the sectional. Not a command this time, an invitation. She sank into leather that probably cost more than 3 months of her former salary, feeling desperately out of place in her server's uniform. Kangdae moved to a sideboard and poured 2 glasses of something amber and expensive, returning to hand her one before settling beside her. Close again, always close. "Drink." The whiskey burned beautifully, warming paths down her throat and into her chest. She took another sip, letting it fortify her. "Tell me what you want," Kangdae said, his voice dropping to that intimate register that made her skin prickle. "Revenge? Justice? Money?" Celeste turned to him, really looked at him for the first time without the barrier of her invisible waitress mask. He was beautiful, in a dangerous way. Sharp cheekbones, dark eyes that missed nothing, lips that suggested both cruelty and devastating skill. Power radiated from him like heat from a furnace. "My father's name cleared," she said quietly. Public acknowledgement that he was cheated, not incompetent. That he didn't fail. He was destroyed by design. And I want Stone to lose everything the way my father lost everything. Something flickered in Kangdae's eyes. Respect mixed with dark satisfaction. "Then we're aligned," he said. "But you need to understand something. Stone has immunity. Municipal shield laws protect councilmen from most civil prosecution. Taking him down requires more than evidence. It requires strategy, resources, and willingness to operate in spaces where the law is a suggestion rather than a boundary." He leaned closer, and Celeste's breath caught. "It requires me," he finished softly. "My resources, my connections, my methods. Are you prepared for what that means?" "I watched my father die while Stone walked free," Celeste said, her voice steady despite the way her pulse hammered. "I'm prepared for whatever it takes." Kangdae's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. Something darker and more honest. Du-yun will be assigned to you as your security chief and resource coordinator. Whatever you need, documents, access, legal research, physical protection, he provides. You'll have unlimited access to my legal team, my investigators, and my network. Your only job is to find the angle that destroys Stone legally, while I handle everything else. My license was never revoked, only dormant. Your legal team helped reactivate it this morning. He reached out and tucked a strand of hair that had escaped her bun behind her ear, the gesture shockingly intimate. His fingers lingered against her cheek for half a heartbeat. "But you're not just getting my resources, Celeste. You're getting my protection. Anyone who comes for you comes through me first. Understand?" The intensity in his gaze made her mouth go dry. This wasn't just a business arrangement. This was something else. Something that felt like possession wrapped in silk and danger. "Why?" The question escaped before she could stop it. "Why would you risk so much for someone you barely know?" Kangdae's jaw tightened. He stood abruptly and moved to the windows, rain-streaked glass framing him like a portrait of controlled violence. "Because I know what it's like to be used as a weapon against innocent people," he said quietly. 5 years ago, I facilitated a land acquisition. I didn't ask enough questions. I didn't look past the money and the strategic advantage. A community center in Bronzeville was destroyed to make room for luxury condos that were never built. 30 families lost their gathering place, their sanctuary. He turned, and for the first time Celeste saw something raw and unguarded in his expression. I can't undo what I did, but the community center I was trying to build, the one Stone tried to steal with that contract. That's my penance. My attempt to build something that gives back instead of taking. Your father wasn't a criminal, Celeste. He was collateral damage in someone else's greed. That's the same sin I committed. So when I say I owe you everything for stopping me from making that mistake again, I mean it spiritually, ethically. I mean it in my bones. The confession hung between them like a bridge across an impossible distance. Celeste stood slowly, her legs unsteady, and crossed to him. She stopped close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his body, close enough to see the gold flecks in his dark eyes. Then we both need this, she whispered. You need redemption. I need justice. Maybe those are the same thing. Kangdae's hand came up, his fingers grazing her jaw with shocking gentleness. The touch sent electricity racing down her spine. Maybe they are, he agreed softly. The moment stretched, heavy with possibility and danger. Then Do-Yun's voice cut through from the elevator entrance. Boss, the security team swept Miss Kennedy's apartment. It's clean, but we found this. He held out a worn leather binder, corners bent from years of handling. Celeste's breath stopped. My father's evidence binder, she gasped. I thought it was lost when I had to move. She took it with trembling hands, the familiar weight of it both comforting and agonizing. Her father had meticulously documented everything. Contracts, correspondence, photographs of the property in various stages of development, appraisal documents that showed the manipulation. Kangdae moved beside her, looking over her shoulder as she opened it. His breath stirred the loose strands of her hair. This is ammunition, he said quietly. This proves intent, pattern, premeditation. It's everything, Celeste whispered. But it wasn't enough before. Before you didn't have me, Kangdae said, his voice dark with promise. Before, you were alone. Now you have an army. He gestured to Do-Yun. Set up the secure room. Everything from the binder gets digitized, analyzed, and cross-referenced with every Stone property deal in the last decade. I want a pattern we can prosecute. As Do-Yun left, Kangdae turned back to Celeste. The vulnerability he'd shown moments ago was gone, replaced by the focused intensity of a man preparing for war. You're not sleeping in your apartment tonight. You'll stay here. My guest room is secure and private. In the morning we begin. Begin what? Celeste asked. His smile was sharp and beautiful and terrifying. Destroying everyone who killed your father. The secure room in Kangdae's club smelled of expensive technology and old leather, creating a contrast that somehow embodied the man himself. Cutting-edge ruthlessness wrapped in traditional power. Celeste sat before 3 monitors, her fingers flying across the keyboard with the muscle memory of her litigator years, while Do-Yun coordinated information flow with quiet efficiency. 72 hours had passed since the contract revelation. 72 hours of barely sleeping, surviving on coffee, and the burning need to finally see justice served. Her father's evidence binder lay open beside her, its pages marked with sticky notes in her own handwriting from years ago. Notes she'd made before the world had crushed her ability to fight. Kangdae entered without knocking, carrying 2 containers of Thai food that smelled like heaven. He set one in front of her with a look that brooked no argument. Eat. I'm close to something, Celeste protested, but her stomach betrayed her with an audible growl. You're no good to me if you collapse, he said, settling into the chair beside her. Close again. Always close. Their thighs touched, and even through her jeans and his suit pants, the contact burned. Eat while you explain what you found. She picked up the chopsticks, grateful for something to do with her hands besides obsess over the spreadsheet of property transfers dominating the center monitor. Stone and his son have facilitated 23 property seizures in the last 6 years, using variations of the same eminent domain clause. Every single one followed the same pattern. Approach small property owners with development partnerships, get them to sign contracts that look protective but contain trap language, then trigger eminent domain through municipal ordinances Stone helped draft. She pulled up a network diagram on the left monitor. But here's where it gets interesting. Every seized property eventually ended up owned by one of 3 shell companies. I trace the ownership through 5 layers of corporate veils. They all connect to the same silent partner providing the acquisition funding. Tae-suk, Kangdae said, his voice dropping to that lethal register. Tae-suk, Celeste confirmed. He's not just your rival. He's been systematically targeting properties that would give him strategic advantages in Chicago's development corridors. Your community center site? That would have completed a continuous ownership block from Bronzeville to Hyde Park. 23 properties. Combined value of nearly $400 million after development. And Stone gets 10% facilitation fees plus guaranteed contracts for all municipal improvements. She turned to look at him and found his expression terrifyingly calm, the kind of calm that preceded violence. This isn't just corruption, she continued. This is organized, systematic theft, disguised as urban development, and they've been doing it for years without anyone putting the pattern together. Because the victims were small, Kangdae said quietly. Individuals, families, people without resources to fight City Hall and a councilman with immunity. Exactly. Du-Yoon's voice cut through from the doorway. Boss, we have a problem. The tension in his tone made Celeste's stomach clench. Kangdae straightened, his body language shifting into combat readiness. Show me. Du-Yoon pulled up a document on the right monitor, and Celeste's world tilted sickeningly. It was a scanned letter on Morrison and Webb Associates' letterhead, dated 18 months after her father's death. Her hands went cold. What is this? She whispered. We found it buried in the city's archived settlement files. Yun said carefully. It's an NDA, non-disclosure agreement, signed by your father 8 months before he died. Your father signed this NDA 6 months before he passed, and after his death, your mother inherited the remainder of the settlement terms. That's impossible. Celeste's voice sounded foreign to her own ears. He never signed anything. He refused to settle. He fought until. Read the signature clause, Kangdae said softly. She forced her eyes to focus through the sudden blur of tears. The signature line showed her father's name, but also a secondary signer. Co-petitioner for the estate settlement. Her mother's name. No. The word came out broken. No. My mother was devastated. She supported him. There's more, Du-Yun interrupted gently. He pulled up another document. A land deed, filed 6 weeks ago. Your mother sold her inherited interest in your father's original property. The interest she retained through the settlement, to one of Tae-suk's shell companies, for $800,000. The room spun. Celeste gripped the edge of the desk, her knuckles white. She knew, she whispered. She knew about the trap, about the settlement terms, about everything. The NDA explains why your father couldn't pursue legal action after the partial settlement, Kangdae said, his voice carefully neutral. And why he couldn't tell you the full truth. But your mother wasn't bound by the same restrictions on the inherited interest. She could have fought. Instead, she waited until you were gone and sold to the same people who destroyed him. Celeste couldn't breathe. The betrayal crashed over her in waves. Not just Stone's original theft, but her mother's complicity. The woman who'd cried at the funeral, who'd held Celeste while she sobbed, who'd told her to move on, to build a new life, to let go of the anger that was poisoning her, who'd been paid to say those words. Where is she? Celeste's voice came out flat, cold, stripped of everything except the need to know. Fort Lauderdale, Du-Yun said quietly. She bought a condo on the beach, used the money from the sale as a down payment. The Thai food sat forgotten, cooling in its container. Celeste stared at the documents on the screen, her mind racing through every memory, every conversation, recontextualizing her entire understanding of the last 2 years. She'd been alone. Truly, completely alone. And she hadn't even known it. Kangdae's hand covered hers where it gripped the desk edge, his warmth shocking against her frozen fingers. Breathe, he commanded softly. You're not alone anymore. She turned to him, and whatever he saw in her face made his expression shift, darken with protective fury. She chose money over you, he said. Over your father's memory, over justice. That's her sin, Celeste. Not yours. Never yours. The NDA taints the evidence binder, she said, forcing her mind back to the legal angles because that was safer than feeling the full weight of her mother's betrayal. If my father signed a settlement agreement with a non-disclosure clause, using his documents against Stone could constitute a breach. Stone's lawyers will argue that any evidence from the binder is inadmissible because it violates the settlement terms. Then we don't use the binder directly, Kangdae said. We use it as a map. Every document in there points us toward public records that aren't covered by the NDA. Property filings, municipal permits, city council meeting minutes. We reconstruct the evidence through independent channels. That will take time, Dian said. Then we take the time, Kangdae replied. His hand tightened on Celeste's. But we do it right. We do it in a way that can't be challenged or dismissed. We build a case so airtight that Stone's immunity won't save him. Celeste forced herself to nod, to focus on the path forward rather than the devastation behind. But inside, something fundamental had cracked. The last thread connecting her to the life she'd known before had been severed. Not by time or distance, but by the bitter reality that her mother had chosen survival over honor. She was truly alone now, except for the dangerous man beside her, whose hand on hers felt like the only solid thing in a world that had proven itself entirely hollow. I want to see everything, she said, her voice hardening. Every property transfer, every shell company, every piece of the network. I want to understand exactly how deep this goes, and exactly how many people need to fall. Kangdae's lips curved into something dark and approving. Now you're thinking like someone who wants to win, he said softly. Not just someone who wants justice, someone who wants blood. And maybe he was right. Maybe justice and blood were the same thing when the crime was this deep, this personal, this unforgivable. The next 72 hours blurred into an exhausting choreography of legal research, strategic planning, and the growing awareness that Celeste Kennedy was becoming someone entirely new. Not the broken daughter, not the invisible waitress. Something sharper, more dangerous. Kangdae's private study had become her war room. 3 walls of floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Chicago's glittering skyline, a city that had nearly destroyed her, that she was now preparing to hold accountable. The 4th wall was pure function. Whiteboards covered in flowcharts mapping Stone's network, bankers' boxes full of public records, and her father's evidence binder displayed in a frame like the sacred relic it had become. She stood before the whiteboard at 2 a.m, adding another connection line, when Kangdae entered carrying 2 glasses of whiskey. He'd shed his jacket hours ago, his white shirt rolled to the elbows, exposing forearms corded with lean muscle. The sight did something to her pulse that had nothing to do with fear. You need sleep, he said, handing her the glass. I need answers. But she accepted the whiskey, letting the burn ground her scattered thoughts. The immunity clause is the problem. We can prove intent, pattern, conspiracy, all of it. But Stone's protected by limited municipal immunity. Civil suits bounce off him. Criminal charges require extraordinary circumstances and prosecutorial will we don't have. Then we create extraordinary circumstances, Kangdae said, moving to stand beside her at the whiteboard. His shoulder brushed hers, and she fought the urge to lean into his warmth. How? By making it impossible for the city to ignore him. By building public pressure so intense that protecting Stone becomes politically toxic. His finger traced one of the connection lines. But you're focused on the wrong angle. What do you mean? You're thinking like a litigator. Sue him, prosecute him, win in court. Kangdae turned to her, his dark eyes intense. But Stone's power comes from being politically untouchable. We don't beat him in court first. We beat him in public perception. Once he's exposed, once the voters turn on him, the immunity becomes meaningless because he'll have no political capital left to hide behind. Celeste's mind raced, refocusing. A media campaign, leaked documents, testimony from victims. Exactly. We flood the zone. Every major outlet, every social media platform. We make Stone's name synonymous with corruption. He smiled, and it was beautiful and vicious. Then we let the city council turn on him to save themselves. Politicians are simple creatures. They follow power and public opinion. When Stone becomes a liability, they'll throw him to the wolves themselves. But the NDA doesn't cover your testimony about what you witnessed, Kangdae interrupted. Doesn't cover other victims who weren't part of the settlement. Doesn't cover public records we independently verified. His hand came up to cup her jaw, tilting her face toward his. You're not bound by your father's NDA, Celeste. You can speak. And when you do, the world will listen. The touch sent heat cascading through her body. They'd been circling this attraction for days. The accidental brushes, the loaded silences, the way his proximity made her skin electric. Now, in the low light of his study, with the city spread out below them like a game board they were preparing to overturn. The tension finally crystallized into something undeniable. What if I'm not enough? The vulnerability in her voice surprised her. What if I break and can't finish this? Kangdae's thumb traced her lower lip, the gesture both tender and possessive. You've already survived the worst thing that could happen to you, he said softly. Your father's death, your mother's betrayal, your life being stolen. You're still standing, still fighting. You're not going to break now. Not when we're this close. How can you be so sure? His other hand came up to cradle her face, and Celeste's breath stopped. Because I see you, Celeste Kennedy. Not the waitress, not the daughter. You. The woman who risked everything to stop me from making a mistake. The lawyer who dissected a trap in 60 seconds that my team missed. The fighter who won't quit, even when the world has given her every reason to surrender. His forehead touched hers, and his breath was warm against her lips. I'm sure because I know what it looks like when someone refuses to be destroyed. I'm looking at her right now. The kiss was inevitable. Celeste closed the distance, her lips meeting his in a collision of need and hunger that had been building since that first moment in the dining room. Kangdae responded instantly, his hands sliding into her hair, angling her head to deepen the kiss. He tasted like whiskey and dark promises, and Celeste surrendered to it completely. This was danger she chose. Desire that felt like falling and flying at once. His hands on her body were both possessive and reverent, mapping her curves through her clothes as if committing her to memory. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, his eyes were black with want. We should stop, he said, but his hands hadn't released her waist. Should we? Her voice came out husky, challenging. You're vulnerable. I'm your protector. This crosses lines. I'm not vulnerable, Celeste said fiercely. I'm choosing you. I'm choosing this. Don't take that choice away from me because you think I can't handle the consequences. Something shifted in his expression. Respect mixing with barely restrained hunger. If we do this, he said carefully, there's no going back. I don't share, Celeste. I don't do casual. You become mine, and I become yours, and we finish this war together or not at all. Good, she whispered. I don't want casual. I don't want safe. I want whatever this is. This dangerous, impossible thing between us. Kangdae's control finally snapped. He kissed her again, harder this time, walking her backward until her spine hit the wall beside the whiteboard. His body pressed against hers, all controlled power and devastating intent. His hand slid under her shirt, warm against her skin, and Celeste gasped into his mouth. Tell me to stop, he demanded against her lips. No. His smile was dark victory. Then hold on to me. Because once I start, I won't stop until you're completely undone. Dooyeon's sharp knock shattered the moment like glass. Boss, we have a critical development. Kangdae cursed viciously in Korean, his forehead dropping to Celeste's shoulder as he fought for control. After a long moment, he stepped back, his hand steadying her, even as he put necessary distance between their bodies. This isn't over, he promised, his voice rough. I know, Celeste managed, her entire body still trembling. He straightened his shirt and opened the door, his mask of controlled authority sliding back into place so perfectly it would have been frightening if she didn't know what lay beneath it now. Dooyeon entered with his tablet, his expression carefully neutral despite absolutely having heard everything. Boss, Celeste, we found the final piece. He pulled up a document that made Celeste's blood run cold. What am I looking at? Kangdae demanded. The original land transfer paperwork for your community center site, Dooyeon said. Dated 4 days before you signed the purchase contract. Stone pre-filed the eminent domain paperwork, but there's another document attached. An assignment of air and mineral rights. To who? Celeste asked, already knowing the answer. Tae-suk. Through a shell company called Heritage Development Holdings. The land itself might be technically yours after purchase, but the development rights, the actual value, were already transferred before you ever signed. Dooyeon looked between them. The land you were buying was already worthless. This wasn't just a trap. It was a complete theft disguised as a legitimate sale. Celeste's mind raced through the implications. They never intended for Kangdae to develop anything. They were selling him a shell. Property without rights. Even if we void the eminent domain clause, he owns land he can't use. Which means the lawsuit I was planning won't work, Kang Dae said quietly, his voice deadly calm. Civil court can't unwind a transfer that happened before my contract existed. No. Celeste agreed. Civil court can't. But federal court can. Both men turned to her. Rico, she said, her voice strengthening as the strategy crystallized. Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. This isn't just contract fraud. It's a criminal conspiracy involving multiple parties, coordinated across years, designed to systematically steal property through municipal corruption. Stone, his son's firm, Tae-suk's funding network. They're not just conspirators. They're an ongoing criminal enterprise. RICO charges require extraordinary evidence, Du-yun said carefully. We have it, Celeste countered. 23 properties, identical patterns, shell companies all connecting to one funding source. A councilman using his political position to facilitate theft. And now we have proof they pre-filed the seizure paperwork, showing premeditation and criminal intent. Kang Dae's smile was sharp and terrible. RICO bypasses Stone's immunity, he said. Federal charges don't care about municipal protections. Exactly. But we need to move fast. If Stone realizes we've found the pre-filing documents, he'll have them destroyed, and we need leverage. Something that forces him to fight us publicly, rather than making this disappear quietly. The media campaign you mentioned, Celeste said. We file the RICO suit and simultaneously release the story to every major outlet. Stone can't make it disappear if the entire city is watching. He'll fight back, Kang Dae warned. He'll use your mother's settlement against you. He'll attack your credibility. He'll make this ugly. Celeste met his gaze without flinching. Let him try. I'm done hiding. I'm done being invisible. He took everything from me once. He doesn't get to do it again. Kang Dae crossed to her, his hand cupping the back of her neck in a gesture that was both possessive and protective. Then we do this together. But we do it smart. We need one more thing before we file. What? Celeste asked. His eyes glinted with dark satisfaction. We need Stone to make a mistake. A public, undeniable mistake that proves he's exactly what we say he is. And I know precisely how to make that happen. Du-yun cleared his throat. Boss, there's one more complication. The immunity clause you mentioned. Stone has it, but it's not absolute. I did some research. His municipal immunity only extends to actions taken in his official capacity. If we can prove he acted outside his role as councilman, if we can show personal profit or criminal intent, the immunity shield collapses. Celeste's pulse quickened. The facilitation fees, 10% of every property seizure going to his son's firm, that's not official business. That's personal enrichment through abuse of office. And RICO statutes specifically address public corruption, Kang Dae added, his voice dropping to that lethal register. If we prove Stone used his position for personal gain through an ongoing criminal conspiracy, the immunity becomes irrelevant. But we still need to make the charges stick in public opinion first, Celeste insisted. The federal prosecutor won't touch this unless there's political will behind it. We need the city demanding his head before we can serve it to them on a legal platter. Kang Dae's hand slid down her spine, coming to rest at the small of her back. An intimate touch that sent heat pooling low in her belly despite the intensity of their planning. Then we give them a show they can't ignore, he said softly. Tomorrow morning we hold a press conference. You, me, 3 of the victims from the other property seizures Do-yun located. We lay out the pattern. We name names. We present the evidence of systematic theft. And we file the RICO suit live, on camera, so Stone can't suppress it. He'll retaliate immediately, Du-yun warned. I'm counting on it, Kang Dae replied. When he does, we'll be ready. Every move he makes will be documented. Every threat will become evidence. He's used to operating in shadows, buying silence, making problems disappear quietly. We're going to force him into the light and watch him destroy himself. Celeste felt something settle in her chest. Not peace exactly, but purpose. Clarity. For 2 years she'd been running, hiding, surviving. Now she was finally fighting back. And she wasn't alone anymore. There's one more thing, she said quietly. My mother. The settlement she took. Is there any way to— No, Kang Dae interrupted gently. She made her choice. You can't save someone who doesn't want to be saved. Focus on what you can control. destroying Stone, reclaiming your father's honor, and building the future you deserve. The finality in his tone was almost comforting. Permission to let go of the last thread binding her to a family that had proven itself broken. Okay, she whispered. Kangdai pulled her closer, his lips brushing her temple. Get some sleep. Tomorrow, we go to war, and I need you sharp. What about you? His smile was dark and beautiful. I have preparations to make, people to call, favors to collect. By the time the sun rises, every media outlet in Chicago will be ready to carry our story. Stone won't know what hit him. Du-Yun excused himself, leaving them alone in the study. The whiteboard behind them held the map of their revenge. The city beyond the windows glittered with lights. Thousands of lives unaware that tomorrow, the carefully maintained fiction of civic virtue was about to shatter. Celeste turned in Kangdae's arms, her hand sliding up his chest to rest against his shoulders. When this is over, he interrupted. You stay with me, not as my employee, not as someone I'm protecting, as mine, completely, permanently. No more hiding who you are. No more pretending to be less than you are. You stand beside me and we build something that matters. Understood? The declaration was pure Kangdae, commanding, absolute, offering no room for negotiation. But Celeste had learned something about herself in the past few days. She didn't want negotiation. She wanted exactly this. Someone who saw her completely, who demanded everything from her, who matched her darkness with his own and called it beautiful. Understood, she agreed. His kiss was searing, claiming, a promise of what would come later when the war was won. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, his forehead rested against hers. Go, he said roughly. Sleep. Tomorrow changes everything. Celeste left him standing in his study, silhouetted against the city he controlled, planning moves in a game she was only beginning to understand. But as she walked to the guest room he'd given her, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Dark, dangerous, sharp-edged hope. The kind that came from knowing you finally had the weapons to fight back. The kind that came from having someone powerful enough to stand with you against impossible odds. Tomorrow, Councilman Richard Stone would wake up to find his carefully constructed empire under siege. Tomorrow, the daughter of David Kennedy would step into the light and tell the truth he'd paid to bury. Tomorrow, the invisible waitress would become visible in a way that would shake Chicago's power structure to its foundation. But tonight, Celeste Kennedy allowed herself to sleep peacefully for the first time in 2 years, knowing that justice, real, unflinching justice, was finally within reach, and that the dangerous man down the hall would burn the entire city down before he'd let anyone take it from her again. The morning air in Chicago carried the scent of impending rain and revolution. Celeste stood before the floor-length mirror in Kangdae's penthouse, barely recognizing the woman staring back. The tailored charcoal suit hugged her curves with precision. Expensive fabric that whispered power with every movement. Her natural hair was swept back into a sleek low bun that exposed the elegant line of her neck, the curve of her jaw. Diamond studs. Kangdae's insistence, borrowed from a collection he claimed belonged to no one, caught the morning light. She looked like a weapon being sharpened for battle. You're ready. Kangdae's voice came from behind her, rough silk in the quiet room. He appeared in the mirror's reflection, immaculate in a black suit that made him look like vengeance incarnated. His eyes traveled the length of her body with an intensity that made her skin flush hot despite the cool air conditioning. I don't feel ready, she admitted, her fingers trembling as she adjusted the collar of her crisp white shirt. He closed the distance between them in 3 measured steps. His hands settled on her shoulders, warm and possessive through the fabric. In the mirror, they looked like what they were becoming. 2 people bound by something far more dangerous than attraction. Stone will retaliate the moment you file, he said, his breath stirring the fine hairs at her temple. He'll go for your throat. He'll try to destroy what's left of your credibility, your family name, everything. I know. And you're still going through with this. Not a question. A statement of fact laced with something that sounded like pride. Celeste met his eyes in the mirror's reflection. My father died believing he'd failed. That he was weak, stupid, incompetent. I'm going to make sure the entire city knows the truth. That he was murdered by men who hide behind law and power. Whatever Stone throws at me, I'll survive it. I've survived worse. Kangdae's hand slid down her arms, a slow caress that left trails of heat in its wake. He turned her to face him, and the intensity in his gaze stole the breath from her lungs. "You're not just surviving anymore, Celeste. You're conquering." His thumb traced her lower lip, and her pulse stuttered. "And after today, there's no going back to invisible. You understand that?" "Yes. The woman who walks into that press conference won't be the waitress anymore. She'll be the enemy of one of Chicago's most powerful men. She'll have a target on her back that never goes away." Celeste placed her hand over his where it cradled her face. "Then it's a good thing I have you." Something dark and possessive flashed in his eyes. "You do, completely. Anyone who comes for you comes through me first. But I need to know you're prepared for what that means. The violence, the ugliness, the reality that some battles are won with blood instead of words." She thought of her father's hollow eyes in that hospital bed, the way her mother had sold his memory for beachfront property, the 2 years she'd spent erased, invisible, half alive. "I'm prepared," she said, her voice steady and cold. "Let's burn it all down." His smile was beautiful and terrible. Then he kissed her. Hard, claiming, a brand that seared through every defense she'd ever built. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, his forehead rested against hers. "Go show them who you really are." The law office conference room blazed with camera lights and the hungry energy of journalists who sensed blood in the water. Celeste stood at the podium, flanked by 3 other victims Do-yoon had located. Middle-aged men and women who'd lost everything to Stone's carefully crafted traps. Behind them, projected on a massive screen, was the network diagram she and Kangdae had built. 23 properties, millions in stolen value, all connecting to Stone and Taesuk. Kangdae stood at the back of the room, a shadow in expensive tailoring, his presence a silent promise of protection and power. Celeste's hands gripped the edges of the podium. The microphone weighted like a loaded gun. "My name is Celeste Kennedy," she began, her voice carrying clear and strong over the crowd. 3 years ago, my father, David Kennedy, lost his commercial property in Pilsen to what he believed was a legitimate municipal development project. He died 6 months later, broken by the loss and the belief that he'd failed his family through his own incompetence. She paused, letting the weight of those words settle. He didn't fail. He was murdered. Not with a weapon, but with documents designed to look protective while being poison. The same man who killed my father tried to do it again last week, to another property owner, using the exact same legal trap, the exact same predatory language. The room erupted with questions. Celeste raised her hand, and the authority in the gesture silenced them. "Today, we are filing a federal RICO lawsuit against Councilman Richard Stone, his son Adam Stone, and their network of shell companies. The evidence shows a coordinated criminal conspiracy spanning 6 years, involving systematic theft of property through abuse of municipal power. 23 families, 400 million in stolen property value. One councilman who used his immunity like a shield while he destroyed lives for profit." She nodded to Do-yun, who distributed folders to every journalist present. "You have copies of the public filings, the property transfer patterns, and the testimony of multiple victims. This isn't speculation. This is documented theft, disguised as civic development. And today, it ends." The questions came in a flood. Celeste answered each with the precision of the litigator she'd been trained to be, her responses sharp and backed by irrefutable evidence. Through it all, she felt Kangdae's gaze on her. Steady, burning, proud. This was power. Not the kind that came from hiding, but the kind forged in fire and wielded without apology. The retaliation came within hours. Celeste sat in Kangdae's car as Do-yun drove them back to the penthouse, her phone exploding with notifications. News alerts, social media mentions. And then, the one that made her blood run cold. Disgraced lawyer's daughter weaponizes grief. Mother reveals truth about Kennedy family settlement. Her hands went numb. The article loaded with agonizing slowness, each word a knife twisting deeper. In a shocking development, Margaret Kennedy, mother of the woman leading today's controversial lawsuit, has come forward with documents proving her late husband, David Kennedy, accepted a settlement from the city 3 years ago. Mrs. Kennedy, speaking from her home in Fort Lauderdale, expressed concern that her daughter Celeste is weaponizing grief and manipulating facts to pursue a vendetta against Councilman Stone, who Mrs. Kennedy describes as a fair and honest public servant who tried to help our family during a difficult time. The article included photos. Her mother on a pristine beach. Her mother's signature on documents Celeste had never seen. Her mother's tearful interview claiming Celeste had abandoned the family and was now destroying innocent people's reputations for attention. The world tilted. Celeste's vision blurred as her chest constricted with the kind of pain that had no physical source. The agony of betrayal made public, weaponized, used to destroy the last shreds of her credibility. "Pull over," she managed, her voice breaking. Do-yoon complied immediately. The car rolled to a stop in an empty parking structure, and Celeste shoved the door open, stumbling out into the concrete cold. She braced herself against the vehicle, gulping air that wouldn't fill her lungs, her entire body shaking with a grief so profound it felt like drowning. She didn't hear Kang Dae exit the car, didn't register his approach until his hands were on her shoulders, turning her into his chest. He didn't speak, didn't offer hollow platitudes, just held her while she shattered against him, her fingers clutching his jacket like it was the only thing keeping her tethered to earth. "She sold me," Celeste choked out between sobs. "She sold my father's memory, and now she's helping them destroy me." Kang Dae's arms tightened around her, one hand cradling the back of her head. She made her choice. Stone paid her to be his weapon, but she miscalculated. "How?" The question came out broken. "Because she doesn't understand what you are." He pulled back just enough to tilt her face up to his thumbs wiping away her tears with devastating gentleness. "You're not the grieving daughter anymore, Celeste. You're the woman who walked into a room full of predators and made them afraid. One interview from a bot mother changes nothing about the evidence, nothing about the truth. The media will crucify me. Let them try." His voice dropped to that lethal register. "Do-yun." "Already on it, boss," came the reply from beside the car. "I've got 3 journalists who owe us favors ready to run counterstories by tonight. We're framing this exactly as it is. A pauperized, grieving woman being used as a political weapon by the same man who destroyed her family. Stone thinks he's discrediting you. Instead, he's proving your entire case, that he preys on the vulnerable and buys their silence." Celeste forced herself to breathe, to think like the strategist she'd become rather than the broken daughter she'd been. "The settlement documents. If they're real, they taint my father's testimony. But they also prove Stone paid for silence, which supports the RICO pattern of obstruction and witness tampering." "Exactly," Kang Dae said, his hand sliding down to cup her jaw. "Every move Stone makes now is evidence. Every attack is ammunition. He's used to fighting in shadows, buying silence, making problems disappear quietly. We forced him into the light, and now he's panicking. Panic makes people sloppy. What do we do?" His smile was dark and beautiful. "We double down. Tonight you go on the evening news. You show that face, the one that just cried for your father's honor. You tell them Stone is so desperate to hide his crimes that he's weaponizing a grieving mother against her own daughter. You make Chicago see exactly who they're dealing with." "I don't know if I can." "Yes, you can." His forehead touched hers, and his voice softened to something almost tender. "Because you're not alone anymore. Because I'm standing beside you. Because we're going to win this, Celeste. And your father's name will be cleared. I promise you that." The conviction in his voice, the absolute certainty, cracked something open inside her chest. Not despair this time. Something hotter, fiercer, rage. "Okay," she whispered. "Let's make them pay." By nightfall, the narrative had shifted. 3 major outlets ran stories questioning Stone's tactics and highlighting the suspicious timing of Margaret Kennedy's sudden appearance. Social media exploded with support for Celeste. The hashtag number Justice for Kennedy trending alongside brutal takedowns of Stone's record. And Celeste Kennedy, her eyes still red from crying but her voice steady and cold, gave an interview that would be replayed for weeks. "My mother made her choice," she said, looking directly into the camera. "Stone paid for her loyalty, just like he's paid for everything else he's stolen. But I'm my father's daughter, and I don't break. I don't bend. I don't disappear quietly. So let Councilman Stone keep attacking. Every move he makes proves exactly what I've been saying. That he's a predator who destroys families and hides behind power. but his power ends the moment Chicago decides they've had enough. And I think they already have. Back in the penthouse, with the city glittering below them and the scent of rain finally breaking through the heat, Celeste stood at the windows feeling hollowed out and strangely alive all at once. Kang Dae approached with 2 glasses of whiskey, handing her one before settling beside her. Their shoulders touched, and the contact was grounding. "You did well tonight," he said quietly. "I cried on camera. You showed them you're human, that you've lost something real. Stone can't compete with that. His humanity is a lie wrapped in expensive suits. Yours is raw and undeniable." She sipped the whiskey, letting it burn away the last traces of tears. "What happens now? Now we wait for him to make his next mistake, and while we wait..." His hand found hers, their fingers tangling together. "We prepare for the immunity fight, because that's where this war will be won or lost." Celeste turned to him, studying the sharp planes of his face in the low light. This man who'd given her weapons when she had none, who'd stood between her and destruction without flinching, who'd traded pieces of his own empire to protect her heart. "Why?" she asked softly. "Why do you care this much?" His free hand came up to cradle her face, and the look in his eyes was almost painful in its intensity. "Because you walked into my world and saved me from becoming the monster I was trying not to be," he said. "Because your courage reminds me why I started fighting in the first place. Because when I look at you, I see someone who refuses to be destroyed no matter how hard the world tries." He leaned in, his lips hovering just above hers. "And because the moment you spoke in that dining room, something inside me recognized something inside you. Like calls to like, Celeste, darkness to darkness, survivor to survivor." The kiss was inevitable. Celeste closed the distance, pouring every ounce of her gratitude, her rage, her devastating need into the press of her mouth against his. Kang Dae responded with controlled hunger, his hands sliding into her hair, angling her head to deepen the kiss until she was drowning in the taste of him. Whiskey and smoke and promises kept. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, his forehead rested against hers. "After we destroy Stone," he said roughly, "I'm keeping you. Permanently. Completely. No more hiding, no more half measures. You become mine, and I become yours, and we build something that matters. Agreed?" Celeste's answer was another kiss, fierce and claiming, a yes written in the language they both understood best, absolute, uncompromising commitment forged in fire. Outside, the rain finally came, washing Chicago clean while inside. 2 people who'd been broken by the city's cruelty began planning how to remake it in their own image. The courthouse smelled of old wood polish and tension. Celeste sat at the plaintiff's table in another borrowed suit, this one midnight blue that made her skin glow against the stark white of her blouse. Her hands rested calmly on the table's surface, but beneath the veneer of composure, her heart hammered against her ribs. Stone's legal team filled the defense table. 6 attorneys in matching power suits, their collective presence designed to intimidate. But it was Stone himself who commanded attention. Silver-haired, distinguished, wearing his councilman authority like armor, he exuded the confidence of a man who'd never faced consequences for his actions. Their eyes met across the courtroom. Stone's smile was cold and dismissive, the look of a predator who'd already won. Celeste smiled back, let him underestimate her. Judge Patricia Morrison entered, and the courtroom rose. Morrison was known for her sharp mind and zero tolerance for legal theatrics. Exactly the judge they needed. "We're here on a motion to dismiss based on limited municipal immunity," Morrison said, settling into her chair with the weariness of someone who'd seen every trick in the book. "Counselor Stone, you may proceed." Adam Stone. Younger, sharper. His father's cruelty refined into Harvard polish, rose smoothly. "Your Honor, Councilman Stone's actions as outlined in the complaint were taken entirely within his official capacity as a city council member. Limited municipal immunity shields elected officials from civil liability for discretionary acts performed in good faith. The plaintiff's RICO allegations, while sensational, don't overcome that immunity. We move for immediate dismissal." The argument was clean, practiced, designed to shut down the case before it could breathe. Judge Morrison turned to Celeste. "Miss Kennedy?" Celeste stood, and the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. She moved to the podium with the controlled grace of a woman who'd spent 3 years being invisible and had finally decided to be seen. "Your Honor, The defense is correct that limited immunity exists. But it's not absolute. Immunity shields officials from liability for discretionary governmental functions performed in good faith. The key phrase is "in good faith." She pulled up a document on the courtroom's display screen. The pre-filed eminent domain paperwork Do-Yun had uncovered. 4 days before my client was scheduled to sign the purchase contract, Councilman Stone filed eminent domain paperwork for that exact property, not after the sale, before. Which means he wasn't exercising discretionary governmental authority. He was orchestrating a criminal conspiracy to defraud. Adam Stone shot to his feet. Objection. This is pure speculation. It's dated evidence from the city's own files. Celeste cut in smoothly. Your Honor, immunity doesn't apply when the official acts with malice or outside the scope of their authority. Pre-filing a seizure for property not yet owned isn't governance. It's theft with premeditation. That's criminal conduct, and it destroys any immunity claim. Morrison leaned forward, studying the document. Counselor Stone, how do you explain this filing date? Adam Stone's composure cracked for just a moment, a flicker of panic before the mask reassembled. The filing was precautionary. Standard procedure for properties under consideration for future municipal use. 4 days before a private sale? Morrison's skepticism was palpable. That's not procedure. That's specific intent. Celeste pressed the advantage. Your Honor, we're also filing a writ of mandamus compelling the city to open their archived land transfer records for the past 7 years. If Stone's immunity claim has merit, those records will support it. But if they show a pattern of pre-filed seizures coordinated with private sales, which we believe they will, then we've established systematic criminal conduct that no immunity can shield. The courtroom erupted. Stone's team shouted objections while reporters in the gallery frantically typed. But Morrison's gavel came down with finality. Motion to dismiss is denied. Miss Kennedy's writ of mandamus is granted. The city archives will be opened under court supervision within 48 hours. She fixed Stone with a withering look. Counselor, if those archives contain what Miss Kennedy suggests, you and your client will have far bigger problems than a civil suit. This court is adjourned. Celeste barely made it to the courthouse steps before Kangdae's hand caught her elbow, spinning her into the shelter of a marble column away from the cameras. His eyes blazed with something fierce and proud. You eviscerated him, he said, his voice rough with barely restrained emotion. The archives are the key, Celeste replied, though her hands were shaking now that the adrenaline was fading. If Stone realizes what's in there before we can secure it, he already knows. Kangdae's jaw tightened, which means he's going to try to destroy the evidence before the court can catalog it. We have a 48-hour window. What do we do? His smile was dangerous. We don't wait for the court. We go tonight. Chicago City Hall after midnight was a cathedral of shadows and secrets. The building loomed against the night sky, its windows dark except for the scattered lights of cleaning crews and late-working bureaucrats. Celeste stood in the alley behind Kangdae's car, her practical clothing, black jeans, dark sweater, hair tied back, a stark contrast to the courtroom power suits. This is illegal, she said, though her pulse raced with anticipation rather than fear. Highly, Kangdae agreed. He'd shed his suit jacket, working in a black button-down that made him look like sin incarnate. But the writ gives us legal access in 48 hours. We're just expediting the process. Do-Yun emerged from the building's service entrance, his expression grim. Security rotation just changed. You have a 12-minute window before the next sweep of the basement archives. Cameras on the east stairwell are already looped. Once you're in, you're invisible. How do we find the right documents? Celeste asked. You tell me, Kangdae said, handing her a building schematic. You know how these systems work. Where would they file fraudulent land transfers? Celeste studied the map, her litigator brain clicking into gear. Real property divisions, sub-basement level. Pre-2020 physical files would be in the auxiliary storage, organized by district and date. If Stone pre-filed those seizures, they'd be cross-referenced under both the property address and the municipal project code. Then that's where we go. Kangdae's hand found the small of her back. Stay close. Stay quiet. If something goes wrong. Nothing will go wrong, Celeste interrupted. We didn't come this far to fail now. Their eyes met in the darkness, and something passed between them. Understanding, trust, the absolute certainty that they would face whatever came next together. The archives smelled of dust, old paper, and decades of buried secrets. Celeste moved through the narrow aisles between towering filing cabinets, her small flashlight casting golden circles on faded labels. Kangdae followed like a shadow, his presence both protection and distraction. She was acutely aware of his body heat in the cold basement, the controlled power in his every movement. District 7, 2019 to 2022, she whispered, running her fingers along the cabinet labels. This is it. The drawer stuck. Kangdae moved behind her, his arms bracketing her body as he gripped the handle and pulled with controlled force. The metal shrieked softly, then gave way. The proximity made Celeste's breath hitch, his chest against her back, his jaw near her temple, the scent of him overwhelming in the confined space. Found it, she managed, forcing her focus to the files. Her hands trembled as she pulled the first folder. There. The eminent domain filing for her father's property, dated 8 months before the actual seizure. And another. 23 properties, all with pre-filed paperwork, all following the exact same pattern. They kept everything, she breathed. Every fraudulent filing, every bit of evidence. They thought immunity made them untouchable. Photograph every page, Kangdae said, handing her his phone. We need redundant copies in case. The sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. They froze. Celeste's pulse spiked as she recognized the voices. Stone and 2 others, their words carrying through the basement's acoustic quirks. Should have been destroyed years ago. The Kennedy woman's writ forces our hand. The files are comprehensive, another voice replied. Adam Stone. If they're cataloged before we can sanitize them, we're finished. Then we sanitize them now. Burn everything in District 7. Make it look like an electrical fire. By the time investigators sort through the damage, we'll have rewritten the narrative. Celeste's blood ran cold. They were going to destroy everything. Not just her evidence. Decades of records that could free other victims, expose the full scope of Stone's crimes. Kangdae's hand pressed against her mouth, silencing her instinctive protest. His other arm wrapped around her waist, pulling her deeper into the shadows between cabinets. They pressed together in the darkness, her back to his chest, barely breathing as footsteps approached their aisle. The beam of a flashlight swept past, missing them by inches. Celeste felt Kangdae's heart hammering against her spine, his breath warm against her ear. His hand on her stomach flexed protectively, and despite the terror of discovery, heat coiled low in her belly at the intimacy of their position. Hidden together in darkness, sharing breath and space and danger. Start with the 1920 cabinets, Stone's voice commanded. Everything burns. The footsteps moved away toward the far end of the archives. Kangdae's lips brushed Celeste's ear as he whispered, We need to move, now. But moving meant leaving the files, leaving the evidence, letting Stone destroy the proof that could free not just her father's name, but dozens of other victims. No, Celeste breathed. We take everything we can carry. He doesn't get to erase them again. Celeste, help me or get out of my way. For a heartbeat, she thought he'd argue. Then his arms released her, and he moved to the cabinet with deadly efficiency. Grab what you can. Prioritize anything with Stone's signature or your father's property code. 60 seconds, then we run. They worked in frantic silence, pulling files and stuffing them into Celeste's backpack and inside their clothing. The smell of gasoline drifted through the archives, followed by the distinctive click of a lighter. Time's up, Kangdae hissed. Smoke began curling through the aisles. Celeste grabbed one last folder, her father's complete file, the one with his signature still visible on the fraudulent documents. And then Kangdae's hand closed around her wrist and they were running. Behind them, flames caught with a hungry roar. They burst through the service exit just as the fire alarm shrieked to life. Do-yeon already had the car running, door open. They dove into the back seat in a tangle of limbs and stolen files, and the vehicle peeled away into the night as sirens wailed in the distance. Celeste's lungs burned from smoke and exertion. Beside her, Kangdae coughed roughly, his hand still gripping hers with bruising intensity. Their eyes met in the dim interior, and suddenly the laughter came. Wild, breathless, edged with the manic relief of survival. We just committed arson, evasion, and evidence theft. Celeste gasped between laughs. Technically, they committed arson, Kangdae corrected, his grin sharp and beautiful. We just refused to let them succeed. The files lay scattered between them. Proof of Stone's crimes. Rescued from flames meant to erase them forever. Celeste picked up her father's folder with shaking hands, her laughter dying as the weight of what they'd recovered settled over her. "We have enough," she whispered, "to prove everything, to clear his name." Kangdai's hand cupped her face, tilting her gaze to his. His thumb traced her lower lip, a gesture becoming familiar, grounding. "We have enough to destroy them," he agreed softly. "Tomorrow, we turn this over to the federal prosecutors. Stone just committed arson to obstruct a federal investigation. That's a crime even his immunity can't protect him from. What if it's not enough? It will be." His forehead touched hers, and his voice dropped to that intimate register that made her whole body aware of him. "Because you're brilliant. Because you refused to give up. Because you walked into a burning building for your father's honor, and that kind of courage doesn't lose." The car slowed at a red light, and in that suspended moment, with smoke on their clothes and evidence scattered around them, and the taste of victory finally, impossibly within reach, Celeste kissed him. Not gentle, not tentative. A claiming kiss that tasted of ash and triumph and the desperate need to feel alive after dancing too close to death. Kangdae responded with matching hunger, his hands tangling in her hair, pulling her closer as the kiss deepened into something fierce and consuming. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, his eyes were black with desire and promise. "Tonight, we secure the evidence," he said roughly. "Tomorrow we finish this. And after..." "After," Celeste interrupted. "You keep your promise. I'm yours. Completely. Permanently. No more half measures." His smile was devastating. "I'm holding you to that." The light changed. The car moved forward. And behind them, Chicago City Hall burned with all of Stone's carefully buried secrets. Those cabinets were part of the old archival wing, not yet upgraded to fire-suppressed units, which is why the files were vulnerable. While in Kangdai's secured vehicle, the evidence that would destroy him sat rescued and ready for its moment in the light. Those cabinets were part of the old archival wing, not yet upgraded to fire-suppressed units, which is why the files were vulnerable. 3 days after the City Hall fire, Celeste stood in a neutral conference room that smelled of expensive coffee and barely concealed desperation. The space was sterile, corporate, chosen specifically because it belonged to neither side. A DMZ for the kind of negotiations that would never appear in any official record. Across the table sat Tae-suk. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe 40, with the kind of calculated handsomeness that came from excellent tailoring and better genetics. His suit was Savile Row perfect, his watch probably worth 6 figures. But it was his eyes that told the real story. Cold, assessing, the eyes of a man who'd built his empire on other people's ruin and felt no guilt about it. Kangdae sat beside Celeste, his presence radiating controlled menace. Do-yoon stood by the door, ostensibly casual but positioned to intercept any threat. The weight of the moment pressed down like a physical force. "Miss Kennedy," Tae-suk said, his voice carrying the barest trace of an accent. "The woman who's caused so much trouble for my business interests. I must say, I'm impressed. Most people Stone destroys stay destroyed. Most people don't have what I have," Celeste replied evenly. "And what's that? A disgraced lawyer's determination? A mafia boss's protection?" His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Those things are fragile, Miss Kennedy. Easily broken when the right pressure is applied." "Is that a threat?" Kangdae's voice dropped to that lethal register. Observation." Tae-suk spread his hands in a gesture of false reasonableness. "You've both fought admirably. The RICO suit, the media campaign, even last week's dramatic evidence rescue from the fire. Very cinematic. But you're still missing the one thing that actually matters." "Which is?" Celeste asked, though ice was already forming in her stomach. Tae-suk pulled a slim folder from his briefcase and slid it across the table. "The original documents proving your father's innocence. Not the circumstantial evidence you rescued from the archives. Not the pattern analysis showing Stone's crimes. The actual proof that David Kennedy was specifically targeted, set up, and framed as incompetent when he was actually a victim of calculated fraud." Celeste's hands trembled as she opened the folder. Inside were documents she'd never seen. Internal emails between Stone and his son, discussing her father by name. Appraisal reports showing deliberate undervaluation, A handwritten note from Stone. Target the Pilsen property. Kennedy's too proud to fight, and the location completes the corridor. These were the smoking gun. The proof that would transform her father from a cautionary tale about failed business dealings into a recognized victim of criminal conspiracy. Why are you showing me this? Her voice came out hoarse. Because I'm a businessman, and Stone has become a liability I can no longer afford. Tae-suk leaned back in his chair, supremely confident. The fire, the federal attention, the media scrutiny, it's all become too expensive. So I'm willing to provide you with everything you need to destroy him completely. Evidence that will not only clear your father's name but prove premeditation, malice, and specific intent to defraud. What's the price? Kang Dae asked. Tae-suk's smile widened. The Kennedy Community Legacy Center. You give me the naming rights, the development control, and 51% ownership. In exchange, Miss, Kennedy gets her father's vindication, and you both get to walk away from this war without the kind of permanent enemies that tend to shorten lifespans. The silence that followed was suffocating. Celeste's mind raced through the implications. The center was Kang Dae's penance, his attempt to build something good from years of causing harm. Giving Tae-suk control would pervert that mission, turning it into just another profit vehicle for the kind of man who'd enabled Stone's crimes in the first place. But without these documents, her father would remain a cautionary tale. She could prove Stone's pattern, maybe even win the RICO case. But she couldn't definitively clear her father's name, couldn't give him back the dignity Stone had stolen. No, Kang Dae said. Celeste turned to him, shock stealing her voice. The center is my penance, he continued, his gaze locked on Tae-suk. But David Kennedy's honor is worth more than my redemption. Accept the deal, give him the center. Kang Dae. Celeste began, but he placed his hand over hers on the table, silencing her. Your father died believing he was a failure, he said, his voice softening as he looked at her. That shame killed him as surely as the stress. This evidence erases that shame. It rewrites his legacy from victim to martyr. That's worth any price. But the community will still get their center, Kang Dae interrupted. It will just be called something else, and I'll find another way to earn my redemption. But you only get one chance to save your father's memory. Take it. Tears burned in Celeste's eyes. She looked down at the documents, proof of her father's innocence, finally within reach. Then at Kang Dae, who was offering to sacrifice the one thing that mattered most to him to give her what she needed. Why? She whispered. His hand tightened on hers. Because some debts are worth paying. Because your father deserves justice more than I deserve forgiveness. Because... His voice dropped so only she could hear. Because I love you, and this is what love looks like when it's real. The words hit her like a physical blow. Not a declaration meant to manipulate or seduce. A truth offered in the moment it mattered most, when he was choosing her pain over his redemption. Celeste turned back to Tae-suk, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. We accept. The center for the documents. But I want one additional term. You destroy every remaining copy of the trap contract. Every template. Every iteration. No one else gets destroyed the way my father was. Tae-suk considered this, then nodded. Agreed. Stone's methods were always too messy. I prefer cleaner business practices. He slid a contract across the table. Sign here, both of you. And Miss Kennedy. Your father's vindication will be delivered to the federal prosecutor's office by morning. Kang Dae signed first, his signature bold and unwavering. Then Celeste added hers below, her hand steady even as her heart cracked and mended simultaneously. It was done. The call came at dawn. Celeste woke in Kang Dae's bed, where she'd been sleeping for the past week, their relationship having crossed that final threshold the night after the archive fire. His arm was heavy across her waist, his body curved protectively around hers even in sleep. Her phone buzzed. Do-yeon's name flashed on the screen. Stone's been arrested, Do-yeon said without preamble. Federal agents picked him up 2 hours ago at O'Hare. He was trying to board a private flight to the Caymans. The charges include racketeering, conspiracy to commit fraud, obstruction of justice, and witness tampering. The prosecutor is calling it one of the largest municipal corruption cases in Chicago history. Celeste's breath caught. And my father? The evidence Tae-suk provided was delivered as promised. It's already been filed with the court as part of the RICO case. By noon, every major outlet will be running stories about David Kennedy. Not as a failed businessman, but as the first known victim of Stone's systematic fraud. Your father's name is being cleared, Celeste. Publicly. Permanently. The phone slipped from her hand. Kangdae woke immediately, his arms tightening around her as she began to shake with sobs. Not of grief this time, but of relief so profound it felt like being reborn. We won, she gasped against his chest. We actually won. I know, he murmured, his lips against her hair. I know, baby. It's over. You can rest now. But Celeste pulled back, needing to see his face in the pale morning light. His eyes were soft in a way she'd rarely seen, his guard completely down. You gave up your center for me, she said. I'd give up everything for you, he replied simply. The center was about my past. You're my future. There's no comparison. She kissed him then. Soft at first, then deepening as gratitude and love and desperate need collided. His hands slid under the t-shirt she'd borrowed from him, warm against her bare skin. And Celeste arched into his touch with a hunger that had been building for weeks. I love you, she whispered against his mouth. I love you for being ruthless and protective and willing to burn the world down for what matters. I love you for being brave enough to fight back, he replied, his voice rough with desire. For refusing to stay broken, for trusting me with your scars. They came together with the urgency of people who'd survived a war and needed to prove they were alive. His mouth traced fire down her throat, while her hands mapped the lean muscles of his back. The morning light painted them gold as clothing disappeared and skin met skin, and when Celeste finally gasped his name, it was both surrender and victory. The sound of a woman who'd reclaimed not just her father's honor, but her own fierce, unbreakable heart. Afterward, they lay tangled together, breathless and sated, while Chicago woke up to the news that would reshape its power structure. What happens now? Celeste asked, her fingers tracing idle patterns on his chest. Now you become my chief legal counsel, Kangdae said. Now we finish dismantling Stone's network and free every victim we can find. Now we build something better than what we destroyed. And us? He rolled to face her, his dark eyes intense. Us? We're permanent. Absolute. You're mine, Celeste Kennedy, and I'm yours. No more hiding. No more pretending to be less than you are. We stand together and face whatever comes next. Even when it's dangerous? Especially when it's dangerous. His smile was sharp and beautiful. We're not built for safe, baby. We're built for this. The fight, the fire, the absolute certainty that we'd tear the world apart before we'd let it separate us. Celeste kissed him again, softer this time, sealing the promise with her body and her heart. Outside the windows, the city glittered with morning light. Somewhere, Richard Stone sat in a federal holding cell, his empire crumbling. Somewhere, victims were waking to headlines that would validate their losses. And somewhere, David Kennedy's legacy was being rewritten from failure to martyr. A man who'd been destroyed by corruption, but whose daughter had refused to let his death be meaningless. It wasn't a happy ending. It was something better. A hard-won victory that carried scars and cost everything but proved that justice, real justice, was possible when you were willing to pay the price. And Celeste Kennedy, who'd spent 2 years invisible and broken, had finally learned the truth her father never got to know. Sometimes the only way to win is to stop hiding and become the weapon your enemies never saw coming. 3 months later, the groundbreaking ceremony took place on a crisp October morning when the air carried the promise of winter and new beginnings. The empty lot in Bronzeville that had nearly been stolen by Stone's trap now bustled with camera crews, city officials, and community members who'd fought for years to have their voices heard. Celeste stood at the edge of the gathering, watching the crowd with a sense of surreal peace. She wore a burgundy suit that hugged her curves with elegant precision, her hair twisted into a sophisticated updo that exposed the graceful line of her neck. The diamond pendant at her throat, a gift from Kangdae, given the morning after Stone's arrest, caught the autumn light like captured fire. She looked like power, felt like power, was power in a way that had nothing to do with violence and everything to do with hard-won authority. Miss Kennedy? A reporter approached, microphone extended. How does it feel to be here today, after everything you've been through? Celeste turned to face the camera, and her smile was genuine. It feels like justice. Not just for my father, but for every family that Stone destroyed. This center represents what's possible when people refuse to accept that corruption wins. It represents hope. And your father? Knowing that his name has been cleared? The question still hurt, but it was a clean pain now, grief without the poison of shame. My father, David Kennedy, was a good man who was destroyed by criminals hiding behind the law. Today, everyone knows that. His legacy isn't failure anymore. It's courage. The courage to build something meaningful, even knowing that powerful people wanted to steal it. I wish he were here to see this, but I think, somehow, he knows. The reporter nodded respectfully and moved on. Celeste felt Kangdae's presence before his hand settled at the small of her back, a gesture that had become their silent language of connection. "Ready?" he asked softly. She turned to look at him. He was devastating in a charcoal suit, the autumn wind ruffling his dark hair, his eyes warm in a way they'd never been before she'd walked into his life. This man who'd given up his redemption to save hers, who'd stood beside her through every battle, who'd taught her that love could be dangerous and safe simultaneously. "Ready," she confirmed. They moved to the podium together, and when the crowd quieted, it was Celeste who spoke first. 3 months ago, this site was at the center of one of the largest corruption scandals in Chicago history, she began, her voice carrying clear and strong. Councilman Richard Stone and his associates attempted to steal this land through the same fraudulent methods they'd used to destroy dozens of families, including mine. But this community fought back. And today, we're not just breaking ground on a new community center. We're breaking ground on a new promise. That Chicago belongs to everyone, not just the powerful few who think they can take what they want. The crowd erupted in applause. Celeste stepped back and Kangdae moved to the microphone. "This center will provide educational resources, small business support, and community gathering space," he said. "It will be managed by a board composed entirely of Bronzeville residents, ensuring that it serves the people who need it most. And it will be called," he paused, his eyes finding Celeste's, "the David Kennedy Memorial Center for Community Justice." Celeste's breath stopped. That wasn't the name Taesuk had claimed. That was... It took months of negotiations, concessions, and pressure on Taesuk's partners. But I secured the naming rights back. "I bought back the naming rights," Kangdae said quietly, speaking to her now rather than the crowd. "Cost me everything I'd set aside for the project and then some. But your father's name deserves to be on something that represents everything he believed in. Community, justice, and the courage to build something meaningful, even when it's dangerous." Tears blurred her vision. The crowd was applauding again, but Celeste barely heard them over the roaring of her own heart. She crossed to Kangdae, not caring about the cameras, not caring about protocol, and kissed him with everything she had. Gratitude and love, and the bone-deep understanding that she'd found something more valuable than vindication. She'd found home. When they broke apart, Kangdae's hand cupped her face, his thumb wiping away her tears. "Your father's legacy is permanent now," he said softly. "And so are we." That evening, back in the penthouse that had become their shared sanctuary, Celeste stood at the windows overlooking the city she'd once feared and now commanded. Kangdae joined her, carrying 2 glasses of wine, and they stood together in comfortable silence as the sun set over Chicago. Do Yun finished cataloging the final victims from Stone's network. Kangdae said, 47 families in total. We're establishing a restitution fund to help them recover their losses. Using Taesuk's settlement payment? Celeste guessed. Among other sources. His smile was dark with satisfaction. Taesuk is finding that his business interests in Chicago are suddenly facing significant obstacles. Property transfers delayed. Permits denied. Financial partners mysteriously withdrawing. Turns out, when you help destroy a corrupt councilman, you make some powerful friends in City Hall. Celeste leaned into his side, feeling his arm come around her waist. You're bankrupting him. I'm ensuring he never profits from Stone's crimes. There's a difference. Is there? Yes, because unlike Stone, Taesuk will walk away with his life and his freedom. He just won't walk away with anything else. Kangdae's hand traced lazy circles on her hip. Consider it my version of justice. Cold, thorough, and permanent. My dangerous man, Celeste murmured, tilting her face up to his. Your only man, he corrected, before claiming her mouth in a kiss that tasted of wine and promises kept. They made love on the couch as the city lights flickered to life below them. Slower this time. tender in a way their earlier desperation had never allowed. Kangdae worshipped her body with his hands and mouth, murmuring words in Korean that she didn't need translated to understand their meaning. And when Celeste finally cried out his name, it was with the absolute certainty that this fierce, dangerous, unbreakable thing between them was worth every battle they'd fought to claim it. Afterward, wrapped in a throw blanket and each other, Kangdae pulled something from the pocket of his discarded jacket. "I have something for you," he said. It wasn't a ring. It was a key. Old brass, heavy with history and significance. Attached to it was a small metal plate engraved with an address she didn't recognize. "What is this?" "Your father's original property in Pilsen," Kangdae said quietly. "Stone seized it, Taesuk held it through a shell company. I bought it back. The artist studios your father built are still there, protected as historical structures. I had them restored to his original vision." Celeste stared at the key, her vision blurring with fresh tears. "How?" "Carefully, expensively, completely worth it." He closed her fingers around the key. "It's yours, Celeste. Do whatever you want with it. Keep it. Sell it. Turn it into a memorial. But your father's work isn't lost anymore. It's been reclaimed." She couldn't speak, could only press herself against his chest and let him hold her while she wept, for the father she'd lost and the legacy that had been returned. When she finally found her voice, it was rough but steady. "I want to turn it into a legal clinic," she said. "Free representation for people fighting fraudulent land seizures. We'll call it the Kennedy Justice Project." Kangdae's arms tightened around her. "Then that's what we'll do. I'll fund it. You'll run it. And together, we'll make sure no one else loses everything the way your father did." "Together," Celeste echoed, and the word felt like a vow. 6 months after that groundbreaking ceremony, Celeste Kennedy stood in what had once been her father's studio space, now transformed into a clean, modern legal clinic with exposed brick walls and warm lighting. The plaque beside the door read, "Kennedy Justice Project, Legal Advocacy for Property Rights." She'd just finished her first successful case, helping an elderly couple fight an attempted fraudulent seizure using tactics eerily similar to Stone's methods. The couple had wept with gratitude, their home saved, their dignity restored. This, Celeste realized, was what winning actually looked like. Not the courtroom triumph or the media vindication. This, the quiet moment when someone who'd been powerless got their power back. Her phone buzzed. Kangdae's message was characteristically brief. "Dinner at home. Celebrating you. Always celebrating you." She smiled, gathering her briefcase and locking up the clinic. The autumn evening was cool and crisp as she walked to where Do-yoon waited with the car, because some things didn't change, and Kangdae's protection was absolute and permanent. But everything else had changed. She was no longer invisible, no longer hiding. She was Celeste Kennedy, Chief Legal Counsel to Kangdae's organization and Director of the Kennedy Justice Project. She was a woman who'd survived her own destruction and used the pieces to rebuild something better. She was dangerous in all the right ways. And tonight, she would go home to the man who'd helped her become this version of herself, the ruthless one with the tender heart, who showed his love through protection and sacrifice and the absolute refusal to let her be anything less than exactly who she was meant to be. The penthouse smelled of expensive food and candles when she arrived. Kangdae stood at the windows, silhouetted against the city he controlled, holding a glass of wine and radiating that controlled power that still made her pulse quicken. He turned when she entered, and his smile was soft and fierce simultaneously. "There's my brilliant lawyer. There's my dangerous man," she replied, crossing to him and sliding into his arms like she'd been made to fit there. They kissed slowly, deeply, tasting each other and the life they'd built from ash and fury. When they broke apart, Kangdae produced a small velvet box that made Celeste's heart stop. "Before you panic," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "this isn't a proposal. Not yet. Not until you're ready. But I want you to have this." He opened the box. Inside, nestled in silk, was a ring, but not an engagement ring. It was her father's wedding band, restored and polished until it gleamed. "I found it in the property inventory from the settlement," Kangdae explained. "Your mother sold it with everything else. I bought it back. It's yours. A piece of him that can't be taken away again." Celeste's tears fell freely now, beyond her control. She took the ring with shaking hands and slipped it onto her right hand, feeling the weight of it like her father's blessing. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything, for saving me, for choosing me, for loving me enough to fight beside me instead of fighting for me." Kangdai cupped her face, his thumbs wiping away her tears. "You saved me too, you know. The moment you spoke up in that dining room, you saved me from becoming the monster I was afraid I'd already become. You gave me a chance at real redemption. Not the hollow kind I was building with the center, but the kind that comes from actually being worthy of someone extraordinary." "You were already worthy," Celeste said fiercely. "You just needed someone to see it. Then we saved each other." He kissed her forehead, her temples, the corners of her mouth. "And we're going to keep saving each other, every day, for the rest of our lives. Because that's what love is when it's real. Not safety or ease, but two people who refuse to let each other face the darkness alone." "Yes," Celeste agreed. And then, because she'd learned to be brave in all the ways that mattered. "And someday, when you do propose, I'll say yes to that too. Because you're right. We're permanent. Absolute. No going back." His smile was devastating. "I'm holding you to that." They ate dinner overlooking the city that had tried to destroy them, and had instead forged them into something unbreakable. They made love slowly afterward, taking their time to worship each other with hands and mouths and whispered promises. And when they finally fell asleep tangled together, it was with the peace that comes from knowing that justice had been served, love had been earned, and the future, their future, was theirs to build however they wanted. David Kennedy's legacy lived on in the community center that bore his name, in the legal clinic that fought in his honor, and in the fierce heart of his daughter who'd refused to let his death be meaningless. Richard Stone rotted in a federal prison, his empire dismantled, his name synonymous with corruption. And Celeste Kennedy, once invisible, once broken, once powerless, stood beside the most dangerous man in Chicago as his equal, his partner, his perfectly matched piece. The girl who'd hidden behind a server's uniform had become a woman who commanded respect with her brilliance and her courage. The waitress who'd whispered, "Excuse me, sir, but this clause is a trap," had transformed into a force of nature who made powerful men tremble. And the daughter who'd watched her father die had given him back his honor and built a legacy that would protect others from the same fate. This was victory. Real, messy, hard-won, and absolutely permanent. And it was theirs. Thank you for watching. If you want more stories filled with danger, justice, and unstoppable resilience, hit that like button and subscribe. Drop a comment below. I'd love to know what part hit you the hardest. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and stay tuned.